Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to Friday, where it is nearly the end of October. I'm Rita McGrath. You probably knew that. And my guest this week is Frederik Pferdt, who is an expert on the topic of innovation growth, was formerly the chief innovation evangelist for Google, among many other accomplishments. He's coming to us from his geodesic dome in the woods in California. Is that correct?
Yes, Rita. Thank you so much for having me. Yes, and the sun is actually just rising. So I think we're going to have a beautiful sunrise just right behind me in our little forest here in the Santa Cruz Mountains. So super happy to join you.
Oh, I'm delighted to be here. And speaking of your home in the Santa Cruz Mountains, you open this wonderful book called What's Next Is Now, and we'll talk about the book cover in just a sec. But you open the book with what to many people would be a really tragic story, the story of a fire destroying your home. And I thought it was a fascinating sort of very short depiction of your mindset about the things that happen to us that might be discouraging for other people, but you chose to see it in a really different way. And maybe you could tell us that story.
Yeah, Rita, thanks for bringing us back to that time when the wildfires literally just were burning like a mile here from our house. And, when you just have 10 minutes to evacuate your home during those California wildfires, you can literally see two paths. One, you could see the end, or the other, you see an opportunity for a new beginning, right? And I chose to see the latter, which is like a new beginning. So we really turned this situation into something where we said, like, let's reimagine how we live our lives. And so instead of focusing on what might be lost, right, I saw an opportunity to reimagine how we want to live moving forward. And so today we grow our own food, we power our home with solar energy and collect our rainwater, right? So we have our own water source as well. So not just because we had to do so, but we chose to do that. And I think you have always a choice in these moments when something is happening that is out of your control.
And that's really a theme that runs throughout the book. So I guess you left Google maybe 2 years ago, and was that when you decided to start working on the book?
Exactly, yes. So I stepped out of Google about 2.5 years actually ago. And for me, that was really, again, like a choice, right? Where I felt like this is a new beginning, where I want to share whatever I've learned in those 12.5 years, being the chief innovation evangelist at one of the most incredible companies in the world, right? That really was famous for innovation and creativity and so forth, and had an impact on so many people's lives. I wanted to share what I've learned and give that to people, because I feel we are now in a time where we all look for certainty, right? We all want to know what's happening next. But to be honest, no one can tell you. You only can create what's next. And it really starts in your mind. And so training your mind to create a better tomorrow is really what I want to share as a message with people.
Mm-hmm. It's really interesting. And I've done a fair amount of work with Google, and I agree. I mean, it must have been very intimidating to be a chief innovation officer at a company which specifically hires people for their ability to be innovative. That must have been quite the amount of human capital going there. So let's talk about the book cover first of all. So here's the book. What's Next Is Now: How to Live Future Ready. And the book cover is really interesting. I've very seldom seen one that looks like it. So tell us a little bit about the inspiration for that.
Yes. And thanks for showing that. When you, again, like, look into the future, sometimes we, look at the external world, right? We look at, like, what are some of the trends? What are some of the things that are happening related to the future of work, or the future of technology, or the future of climate and so forth, right? What I wanted to do is I want to bring the future close, which means, like, when you look at the book cover, right, you see a blurry image and you see yourself, right? And that's really like the metaphor I want to convey, which is you look at your own future, right? You look at yourself literally, it's still a blurry image, but what you can do is you can imagine your future moving forward as well. And I like how you turn the book already, Rita, which is the second thing I wanna show here, which is really like that. When you shift your perspective and you look at it differently, right? There's a kaleidoscope of colors appearing, right? Which really is about seeing opportunities, right? And looking for those opportunities, right? When you shift your perspective, you zoom in, zoom out, you take a peek from the left or to the right, you really see that something new will actually appear. And I think that's exactly what you can do. You can shift your perspective to see something new.
Mm-hmm.
And the last thing is it's a shape, right? The future is not perfectly square or a perfect circle, but it's a shape. It's like you're holding a clay in your hand, right? And you shape your future literally with every choice you make.
Mm.
And so these three things, I think, are good reminders for us that first, you should always judge a book by its cover, right? That's the first thing, right? And secondly, the future that you create is really starting within ourselves, right? It's starting with our minds, it's starting with shifting our perspective, and it's something that we can actually actively shape. So yeah, excited if people pick that book up and like have a look at their own future as well.
I love that. Well, so just to go back to, I'm always fascinated by how people arrived at the specific place that they were. And you talked about, as a young person, making the decision to experience as many countries, as many cuisines, as many different things as you possibly could, and deliberately putting yourself in situations which were not the same. And that, I gather, is a theme that's carried through because your children tease you for not eating in the same restaurant or staying in the same hotel. And but I also thought it was interesting that your parents provided some stability too. They said, well, we're not sure we agree with your choices, but we'll leave your room here for you. So you can come back if things go dreadfully wrong. And I think it's that interesting combination of adventurousness, but having some calm spaces to go back to that I think helps people take some risks.
Yes. There's really that balance that I want people to explore between like having these new experiences. I talk about like opening new doors, right? Your first door daily, which is like, as you said, like taking a new route to work or try something unfamiliar to eat, right? Or start a conversation with someone you knew, right? And that's really the first doors that are opportunities that help you to learn something new, right? And I really encourage people to actually do that, right? When I moved to California, I once got off the train, right, at a random stop instead of following my usual routine. And that spontaneous choice really led me to a tiny cafe, which I remember, where I met someone who later became a key collaborator on several innovation projects, right? And so would I have just followed my regular routine, I probably would have never met that person, right? And I think that's a good reminder that we should always look for these first doors every day and trying to open as many first doors as possible every day. But the other side, which is like balancing that out, right? With something which gives you stability, which gives you something familiar that you can always go back to. And our minds love to do that, right? Our minds love to kind of just go back to the routines, right? Things that are familiar to us, right? That gives us stability and safety as well. And so my parents really, when I left for college, right, really told me hey, you can go wherever you want, you can do whatever you want, and we encourage you to go explore the world, and you can always come back. So they left me a little room, right, with my bed, and said whenever things go wrong and you just need to come back, you have a place to stay, right? And I felt this really gave me a great safety, a psychological safety to really explore the world. And so far I have not been in that position where I had to go back, right? But I still have that room, and my mom and my dad still have that room available for me, which really is a great way of living your life, where you open these first doors all the time, but at the same time, when you when you fail and like things go tremendously wrong, you always have a place to sleep.
I think that's a wonderful metaphor, and it's a wonderful metaphor for parenting, really, which is you want to encourage your children to go out and try things and take risks, but know that there's a bit of a safety net for them. I think that's a very human thing. I think that's really lovely. So early on, you became an entrepreneur, right? And started a company called Learning Design Labs. And like all entrepreneurs, I bet you thought it was a great idea at the time, but it ended up not working out. I wonder if you could sort of talk a little bit about what you learned through that experience.
Oh yes, that went incredibly well in terms of what I learned as an entrepreneur, right? At that time, so that's probably 18, 19, or even 20 years back, right? I was very curious about an idea and how we can use technology in education, right? That were the days when Web 2.0 and like wikis and blogs and even podcasting was kind of like very new on the market. And so I remember that my PhD advisor back in the days gave me the first iPod and allowed me to produce podcasts for the university. And those were great experiments, which helped me to launch a company for myself, a startup, which I really wanted to help teachers and educators to use more technology in their teaching. None of the educators, none of the teachers saw a need for that, right? Because they all felt like, hey, kids and students will come to classroom, right? We have great environments where people can learn and study and so forth. So there was no need. None of the educators, none of the teachers was ever using anything I was offering. So the startup failed. But fast forward to the beginning of the pandemic, March 2020, right? When everybody literally had to use technology to learn and to study. That's where I got a lot of calls back and said like, hey, Frederik, you had this startup, right? Like, do you still like offer consulting and like help teachers and educators to use technology better in the work they were doing? And so I kind of like laughed and said like, oh, of course, now there's a big need, right, for all of these things that I've done. And luckily, back in the days, I not just started the startup that failed, but also I wrote a PhD thesis around that topic and how to use technology in education. So I could point people towards that. Again, like back in the days, nobody was reading that. But it became like a really hot commodity amongst teachers and educators because they all felt the need for having better technologies and better approaches in their educational systems.
Yeah, and I still don't think we've recovered from the sort of trauma of being suddenly forced to change so much all at once, and I talk to people in companies now, and they talk about this cohort of young people who either missed out on schooling or missed out on their first days on the job, and how different they are from the cohorts before and after, because they've just been in this very, very different environment, this very different human environment. So are you still offering educational materials, or is that part of your past now?
Absolutely. Yeah, that's what I'm still passionate about, right? And I think the whole book is really about that. How can you train your mind to really see possibilities and opportunities in your future as well? And again, I think that's really something that I want to help people to understand. That imagine you're facing like a major life change, right? Maybe it's losing a job or moving to a new city or even going through a breakup, right, in your relationship. The first instinct I think humans have is to seek certainty, right? To know what's going to happen next. That's what we all go towards. Like, we want to know what's going to happen next, right? How is the next relationship going to turn out? What's the new city going to be like? Or do I have a job, right, in a year from today? So that's what most human beings are doing. And you'll think for yourself, will I be okay, right, if things not work out? But none of us, not your friends, not your family, not the experts, no one can give you a clear answer. So now shift that question towards what's next and how can I create it, right? How can I really kind of like create what I want to see happening next? Mm-hmm. So suddenly, instead of waiting for clarity to come from the outside, you realize that the future starts within you. You begin training your mind to see possibilities and not just problems. You can experiment with new opportunities, like a project, a new hobby, or reaching out to someone who inspires you. And so with each of these steps, you start creating momentum toward a future that you design and create. And I think that's something that everybody can learn and everybody can become better at. So you're moving away from that notion that the future is something that we predict towards the future that's something we actually create.
I love that. You know, it connects with so much of the what I think is more intelligent work about topics such as leadership. So, you know, if you look at Hollywood movies, in the heat of a crisis or in a difficult situation, what are leaders doing? They're shouting into the telephone and banging on the tables and everything. But people that have really studied effective leadership and design under stressful conditions have said, no, it's not that at all. It's bringing the emotional temperature down. It's calming yourself. It's taking that sort of mental step back from the situation at hand and really running through the possibilities in your brain and then absorbing some of that uncertainty with the people around you. And I think that's a little bit of what you're picking up in the book.
Absolutely. Yeah. So on average, an adult makes about 33,000 to 35,000 decisions or choices every day, right? So that's a big number, right,
That's
of choices that we make. And that's on average, right? And so these choices include what to eat, you know, what to wear, or what to say and how to say it, right? And so if you really make better choices, right, that are driven by what I call like a future ready mind state. So it's more that you're make choices today that really reflect how you want to be in your future, right? And I think that's something we can all be more intentional about and become more aware that these choices really have a direct impact on our future, right? And so as leaders, you know, what to say and how we say it, right, has a direct impact on our teams, but also on our own futures. And so I think that's something we can become more aware of and move away from that reactive mode, right, where we where our emotions usually come up and like we tend to respond with hatred or with other things, to be more in a state where you respond wisely, right, and you try to really also control the way that your future then will show up.
I really like the emphasis on how people can grasp some agency, even in a situation which seems sort of depressing. Now, you have 6 elements that you talk about in the book that comprise pieces of this future-ready mindset. But before we talk about those, I'd love you to share the story of how you decided to skip dating altogether and figure out if your wife was the right person for you, or the woman who's now your wife was the right person for you.
Yes, that's a story which I share in the chapter on perpetual experimentation, actually, which I like to say that it's better to make progress than focusing on perfection, right? Perfection doesn't exist. Progress does, right? And so for me, what makes experimentation perpetual is that regular experimentation says, I'll try once and see what happens, right? But perpetual experimentation says, I'll keep trying and learning and adjusting until I create what I envision. So the story with finding or kind of like creating that relationship with my girlfriend at that time, who became my fiancée and my wife, and I married 3 times without getting divorced, is that, you know, I told her, like, as a radically optimistic person in the beginning, like on our first date, that this is going to be an incredible relationship. And she looked at me exactly like you, and she's like, how do you know, right? I said, I don't know, but like, this is how I want to go into that relationship, believing that this is going to be the most incredible relationship that we can have, right, in our lives. And so she exactly looked at me like that, and she's like, okay, how can we find out? And I said, like, we need to experiment, right, really quickly to see like how we're gonna live together, how we're gonna really deal with problems that are gonna arise, right, in the future. How do we really find out very quickly and how we respond in different situations, right? So I told her that we should go on a trip that really like pushes us into like these extreme situations. So we packed our backpacks. We went to Vietnam, Cambodia, and really kind of like embarked on these difficult situations for us, where we didn't speak the language, we didn't have a place to sleep most of the time, we took only public transportation, so on buses and trains and so forth. And you really, when you spend like 24 hours together, like 4 weeks in these situations, you really know like how the other person shows up in many different situations, when you're hungry and you don't have where to sleep and all of those things. And after these 4 weeks of experimenting, we really knew like this is going to be an incredible relationship. So now we have 3 kids. We live here off grid, and I just admire my wife for what she does and who she is, and yeah, as I said, like we married each other like 3 times. Last time at Burning Man, and we just have an incredible relationship, because I think we really try to experiment quickly with these micro experiments, to really trying to figure out and learn as quickly as possible if this relationship will be a great one.
I think that is such an amazing story. And, there must have been something special about her feelings for you, that she's agreed to do this crazy thing to begin with. So I guess it's a good first way of finding out if someone is not going to work out, is to propose something like that, right?
Yes, probably.
So let's get to your 6 elements of this kind of new mindset. And the first one that you talk about is radical optimism. And that's, for a lot of people, very difficult to sustain, especially you look around you and you see small wars and a very contentious presidential election, at least in the United States, divisive politics all over. And yet you argue that one of the things you owe to yourself is to really be optimistic. Perhaps say more about that.
Yes, and it's not just optimism, right? I think optimism for me is when you think like things will work out, right? But for me, radically optimistic is I can make things better right now. And one of the things that you can do is a simple shift in your language, right? That can change everything. So replacing but with an and keeps possibilities alive, right? So, for example, if you say, and Rita, you know that, right? When you hear a new idea, I love this idea, but I don't know how to make it happen, right? That's the usual answer that we have, right? We put a but between like the idea and how we make it happen, right? Mm-hmm. And what happens is like our mind just turns away, right? It stops thinking about it. Instead, if you replace the but with an and, you go, I love this idea, and we'll figure out how to make it happen. It's just one word that changes, basically. And so you see and you can feel the difference, right? You're now starting to opening up the conversation about, let's figure it out, right? How are we going to make this idea happen? So a but really stops the conversation. It stops you thinking about like possibilities and what you can do. The and will actually allow you to see progress. It allows you to figure out what's going to happen next. So one of the power practices I like to share is maybe for the next 7 days until next Friday, right? Replace as many buts with ands in your conversation and just track your most powerful and moments, right? And what they actually do for yourself, for your own thinking, and for other people, right? How they open up to see more possibilities. And so again, like if you're like me evacuating your house, right, during wildfires, instead of focusing what might be lost, seeing an opportunity to reimagine how you live. And that is something that you can really train your mind to do, to see in every situation an opportunity. And that's radical optimism at its best.
I love the focus on making things better wherever you are right now. As you do, I can imagine I spend a ton of time in organizations that are just full of people living, what's the old phrase, lives of quiet desperation. If only they would get it, if only they would understand, if only they would get budget, instead of focusing on making wherever you are better. I always tell people, okay, you may not be able to do it for all of Walmart, but you can certainly do it for your team, for your group, for your store, for your floor. There's just ways you could agree to be better together, which I think is lovely. So the next one is this unreserved openness. And I think that's interesting in a very polarized world. How do you do that? How do you stay open to so many possibilities when so many people around you almost take comfort in having a closed mind?
Exactly. And I love what you just shared, which is like most of the time we try to look at other people and trying to change other people, right? But this is an impossible task, right? You can't change other people. You can only change yourself. And even that is hard enough, right? So we shouldn't kind of like, again, as you said, like blame others or like they don't do what I want to, see in the future happening and so forth. Instead, like focusing on yourself and focus on your own choices that you can make. And with that language and change in language from but to yes, to and, right, you really allow what I say, like a yes culture to emerge, because you're now role modeling and saying like, hey, I just showed you that an and will open up the conversation to possibilities, right? And most people will actually follow then, right? So you're trying to really role model and influence people by showing up differently. And I think that's the most powerful way of leading, is leading by example, leading as a role model so that others actually can follow. Mm-hmm. And not wasting your time and saying like, oh, I need to change that person. I need to change that person's approach and so forth. So before we, excuse me, go into unreserved openness, which I love to talk about, I want to just go back to an interesting thing that I want to point people to, which is that difference between mindset and mind state, right? Mm-hmm. For me, mindset has been such a powerful excuse me.
Gesundheit.
Thank you so much. Dankeschön.
Bitte sehr.
Had been such a powerful concept, right? To really see like what your values, what your past experiences, what your belief system is about, and what it can do to really make your future happen. But I also learned that changing your mindset is something very difficult for people to do, right? So what I said is that, excuse me. What I said is that let's change mindset to mind state, because for me, the mind state is the perspective you have in any given moment that really determines how you experience the present. And that is something dynamic. That is something you have control over. That's something you can change, because you can change your perspective. You can shift it around. And I feel mind state is such a powerful way now to look at these things and to really have something that you have control over, that you can change, that's immediately accessible to you as well. And when I was writing the book, and when you use Google Docs and Microsoft Word, and you use all of those tools, right? Every time I typed in mind state, it autocorrected back to mindset, right? That's how ingrained that concept is in our language, even in our technology. And I want to change that. I want to help people to still believe in that power of mindset, but use mindset as something that they have access to, right? It's the perspective you have, again, in any given moment that really determines how you experience the present. And that is something very powerful that people can hopefully take away from today, that they have a mind state that they really have control over. And that is something that they have access to as well.
That's really interesting. One of our frequent viewers, Frank Kalberg, wants to know how you feel about the importance of presence.
So the present moment is such an interesting thing, right? Because our mind doesn't like to spend time in it, right? Our mind likes to go back in time, right? It likes to go into the future to imagine. But the present moment is something where the mind really doesn't like to stay a long time. So we can train our minds to become more aware of what are some of the emotions that are arising in my present moment. What are some of the thoughts that are actually coming to mind as well? And practicing that has some power because, again, the choices you make in the present moment really determine your future. So if you make better choices in the right now, right here, right, you will have a better future that's going to be happening for you. And that's where we see a lot of mindfulness, a lot of meditation, a lot of these practices are really helpful to train the mind to also acknowledge the present moment and trying to really become aware of what's happening in your body, what's happening in your mind, what's happening with your spirit as well. Mm-hmm. So there's there's some really great practices and techniques that you can learn and apply, like meditation, for example, that really helps you to become more aware of the present moment as well.
Yeah, I think one of the most interesting concepts that I've been mulling over recently is actually not a new one. It's an old one. You may be familiar with Rita Hughes's book, The Living Company. And what he talks about is memories from the future. And he makes the point that as human beings, we're sort of evolutionarily programmed to save energy, and mental processing is intense on energy. Your brain is one of the most energy consumptive organs in our body. And so we're constantly trained to figure out what's relevant and what's not in the future. So what most people do, and I think it's interesting that you're talking about how do you grab this and become more intentional about it. Most of us are thinking about the future every day, every minute, right? Oh, am I going to have pasta or a sandwich for lunch? Am I going to take the bus or am I going to take the train? What time is school letting out? Oh, is it a basketball game tonight? We're just running these tapes in our mind that help us sort out what information is relevant and what's not. And what Hughes talks about is, he said, if you really want to be prepared for the future, and one of his big contributions was the idea of scenario planning, which they did a lot of at Royal Dutch Shell. But he said you have to create almost like memories from the future to even make your mind receptive to what could be possible. And I thought that was an interesting kind of concept that's very related to your idea of how do I think about my state of mind at any given point.
Absolutely, yeah. And for me, I like that concept of like memories of the future, right? Like I think it's very powerful. Again, our mind is interesting because it also likes to save energy, right? And at the same time, we're looking for all the dangers that are possibly that are possible in the future as well. So we love to look at the negative news, right? We love to look at like the dystopian scenarios, right? Because that really helps our minds to protect ourselves, right? That we feel like, oh, we now know like what possibly can go wrong. But I want to create the opposite. I want to help people to also look for what possibly can go right, right? What is something that you're looking forward to, where you tell yourself, I can't wait to live in that future because I envisioned it as something better. And one of the most powerful questions probably we can ask ourselves is, how do you want to be in the future, right? Too often we focus on what we want to achieve, our goals and accomplishments. But I think the real magic happens when we ask, who do I want to become? So again, in my life, I found that the times I felt most fulfilled weren't necessarily when I hit a big milestone, right? It was when I lived in alignment with my values, when I choose curiosity over fear, optimism over doubt, or even empathy over ego, right? So again, like when I left Google, and you mentioned that, people kept asking me, hey, Frederik, what's next? And while I had many exciting projects ahead, and the real answer wasn't about what I'm going to do next, but it was about how do I want to be in my next chapter of my life, right? And I knew I wanted to lead with kindness and curiosity and openness and love and sharing. And that realization really shaped every decision I made moving forward. And so think about your own like future, and don't think about like what do you want to have. Think about who do you want to become and how do you want to be. And if you take that question forward in your life, I think you feel like you have 100% now control over your future, because you decide how you're going to show up tomorrow morning, tomorrow afternoon, tomorrow evening, with the people that are surrounding you, with the teams that you're leading, with the communities that you're part of. And that is, I think, something very powerful, because again, the future isn't somewhere we arrive, right? We will never arrive in the future. It's something we shape moment by moment and choice by choice.
That's very inspiring. And it also gets at the idea that, right now, I think we put leaders in this sort of very difficult box. Like on the one hand, you're supposed to be inspiring and decisive and create clear visions of what the goals are and inform people what they're supposed to do. And then on the other hand, you're supposed to be vulnerable and humble and willing to admit your mistakes and that kind of thing. It's like, well, which is it? Right? But what you're talking about, I think, is bringing that mind, that state of mind to your leadership moments, which I think is very inspiring. So we talked about optimism and openness. Let's talk about curiosity next.
Perfect. Yes. So curiosity isn't just about finding answers, right? It's about staying open to what we don't know yet. And I think that's something powerful. But most people ask me, like, what makes curiosity compulsive, right? Because I add this notion to it that I promote compulsive curiosity. And curiosity means asking what else, what if, what's next, all of those great questions, even when we feel uncertain, right? But for me, compulsive curiosity really goes beyond. It's that you keep asking to search even a better question, right? And so what I like to do with my family, for example, is we go on a curiosity walk, right? So instead of following our routine, right, we go somewhere where we just allow ourselves to be guided by questions like, to say, oh, what if we gonna, go there for a moment to this new restaurant? Or what if we, camp at that place that we haven't been to? And we just keep asking ourselves those what if questions that allow ourselves to really keep exploring and go on that curiosity path. There is something fascinating for me as I'm a big fan of sailing and sailboats and just being out in the water. That back in the days, in I think the 1500s and 1600s, there were these maps which basically had on the outside, on the periphery, basically just these monsters, right? That were signaling to you,
Here are
hey, don't go
dragons.
there. Exactly. Dragons and monsters, really horrible figures, right? That they're really signaling to everybody who was reading that map, saying like, hey, don't go there, right? Because we don't know what's there, right? You might fall off the earth. That was the understanding back in the days, 1500s and 1600s. And when people use their curiosity combined with courage, right, they set sail and went beyond what was known. They really went beyond these edges where the monster signal like, don't go there. And what they found was fascinating, because they found the new world, right? They found like something new that nobody was aware of, right? And they found out that the earth is actually not flat, and you can even in your lives now today, you can combine that curiosity, compulsive curiosity, with courage to really discover something new, right? When it comes to AI or new technologies and all of those things, be curious, right? Ask yourself, what if, right? And how can I find out more? And I think that's really powerful, because then you start to learn. You really are an explorer, like the sailors back in the days, that really can then map out like what's the known, or the things that we want to find out, where we have a lot of unknowns at the moment.
Mm-hmm. I think this connects really well to Jeremy Utley, who wrote a great book called Idea Flow. And one of the points he makes is that as humans, we tend to settle on the first sort of satisfactory seeming solution to a problem or an issue. But if you provoke yourself to be really curious, then you might try 7 or 8 or 10 different variations of the answer. And very often the ones that are further down the list are much better than the ones you first came up with.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think in times of AI and technology providing us the best answers, right? I think it's upon us humans to really ask the better questions, right? And I think that's something we can train ourselves in and just follow our curiosity. And what's fascinating for me is that, we are all born as curious individuals, right? But over time, we lose our curiosity, right? We just lose the ability to ask better questions. And so we can bring that back, even in our leaderships. And I think the best leaders for me are the people who ask the better questions. And so if you want to lead your team in a better way, right, ask the better question and allow your team to find the answers for you and with you. And I think that's something that, for me, great leadership is about, is asking better questions.
I love that. So then we've touched already on experimentation, and you showed how you could dispense with dating altogether, which I think is fascinating. But how can people do more experimentation in their daily lives? Because I agree with you that it's really valuable, but it's not something that comes naturally to a lot of people.
Yes, there's one of the power practices I like to do is run micro experiments, right, in an area where you feel stuck, right? For example, if you want to try a new morning routine for just 3 days, right? Most people feel like if they try something new, they have to do it forever, right? Just tell yourself, I'm just going to do it today or for the next 2 or 3 days, right? Just limit the amount of like how long the experiment should actually run and see what you can learn. Or if you want to send a daily gratitude text message, right, to someone that you want to say thank you to, right? Like one of your team members or one of your peers or one of your family members, whoever. And so I think those micro experiments really help you to learn. And so there's an interesting story when we started to garden here, right, and grow our own food after the wildfires, right? We had our greenhouse built up, and it was not perfect, right? Because I'm not an expert in like building greenhouse domes, but I figured I can learn it, right, with my family and with my friends. So when we started gardening, right, I wanted everything to be perfect, right? That was my goal, but nothing went according to plan, right? And eventually I stopped waiting for perfect conditions and just started planting seeds, right? Some grew, others didn't. But with each season, I learned, right, what is growing, what do we want to grow more of, and so forth. And now our garden feeds our family, not because I got it right the first time, but because I kept experimenting. And I think that was a great reminder for me that even if you want to have it perfect, go for progress. Go for, trying to really experiment your way forward, because I feel the path to the future is paved with experiments, right? That's the only way we can actually learn and figure out, like, what do we actually want to see happening in the future?
I would agree. And I think one of the reasons that people stop experimenting, at least in my experience, is they're afraid of being labeled as failures. And I keep telling them, no scientist would say, oh, my hypothesis wasn't supported, I'm a failure. I work with a lot of pharmaceutical companies, and there are scientists there who could go their entire careers without seeing a drug come successfully to market. But they don't see themselves as failures. They see themselves as making progress on a really difficult technological problem. And it's just a really different way of thinking about it. So I'm delighted that you've given a lot of examples in the book of how this works. In case you're just joining us, we're talking about the book, What's Next is Now, How to Live Future Ready, by my guest, Frederik Pferdt. And we've been talking about some of the core building blocks of this mind state, as he calls it. And talk about empathy next.
Yes. Again, for me, like empathy is not just about understanding. It's about letting someone else's experience change what you believe is possible. Mm-hmm. And that is probably one of the most powerful dimensions I talk about in the book, because empathy becomes expansive when it shifts not just how we understand others, but how we see the world, right? And one of the things that made me realize how important empathy is, in not just in your life, but in your life as a leader, in your life as a father, in a life as a community member, and so forth, was a time when we ran a class at Stanford, and we hosted the class at the Fremont School for the Blind and Deaf. And so what we did is we took students from Stanford and we took some Google employees, and together with students from the School of the Blind and Deaf, we hosted what we called a blindfolded breakfast.
Oh.
So at first, everybody, fumbled around and struggling without sight to, figure out like what they can eat. And, they use their senses of like smelling and touch and so forth to, really feed themselves during that breakfast, right? But soon what I observed is that their other senses sharpened. So textures and smells and sounds really became alive. And this experience really helped us to design some of the technologies that we're now using every day, the voice assistant technologies that you have now in your homes, right? And so that was really a powerful way of learning about empathy, right? When you trying to put yourself into the shoes of someone who can't see, right, or can't hear, that you're now coming up with these ideas and how we can build technologies that are really more meaningful and more helpful to people in the world. And so that was a really wonderful experience to really show the power of empathy. Mm-hmm. And so if you want to try that at home, right, try a blindfolded dinner maybe, right, and try to see like, how does it shift your understanding? How does it activate some of the senses that we usually put in the background, right, when we have dinner, right? We usually just use our taste and our smells, but sometimes, other senses can become alive as well. And I think that's something really, really interesting that we all can do more of.
That's really interesting. So we, Annie would like to know if you had to give a piece of advice to a founder who's struggling with effective leadership with their team. What advice would you give them?
So it's interesting that you put effective leadership in here, right? For me, as a founder, I think asking the better questions is probably one of the best ways to lead that organization. Because that curiosity that you show in your leadership, right, by asking great questions, is something that you can use as an advantage, right? If you look at larger organizations that are established, right, what's most interesting is that they lose one thing over time, and that is their curiosity, right? You still have that curiosity as a startup founder where like you basically just have a great question that you want to find answers to, right? And so keep that curiosity and really lead with that curiosity as well in your leadership. The second thing I would probably highlight is empathy, right? As we just talked about, right? Empathy for the people you're leading, right? Really trying to understand them on a deeper level, I think is very powerful to really become an effective and incredible leader as well.
Love that. I love that. I'm curious, just as we're thinking about startups versus established corporations, one of the things I've been mulling over is whether technologies can begin to substitute for a lot of what we in conventional companies rely on managers to do, allocating tasks and monitoring progress and providing feedback and all that stuff. And so it's a concept I'm calling permissionless organizations. And I wonder if you're seeing any glimmerings of that in the companies that you've been working with.
Yeah, tell me more about that permissionless organization. I'm curious about that concept.
Well, the idea is that if you can push decision rights as close to the edges of the organization as possible, you can, first of all, you'll have much richer information flows than if you were relying on someone distant from that situation to make the decision. But you can also then empower people, and not that I really like the word empower, but you can give people decision rights where the most information is. But if you provide clarity about, what's not negotiable and what is, and people can then move much more quickly. They can be much more agile. They can work conflicts and difficulties out themselves rather than relying on a more formal bureaucracy. And I think another piece of this is that we tend to confuse, in my view, hierarchy with bureaucracy. And I think they're two completely different structures. Much of human society, much of nature depends on hierarchies, even if they're temporary, right? If you were in a hunting party in a hunter-gatherer society, there would be a little hierarchy. There would be somebody who would be leading at any particular point in time, and others who would be in a support role. And it might just last for one afternoon, but it's a little mini hierarchy. That's very different than a bureaucracy, right? Which actually was the interesting thing about bureaucracy to me is that was considered an improvement in management over what came before, which was basically craftspeople, each leader running an individual guild on the basis of inheritance or on the basis of some kind of formal authority. So bureaucracy was supposed to apply science to management. So we have the division of labor, the specialization, the power differentials, the decision rights sort of up at the top of the organization where all the information came up, and. And so now I'm wondering if we're looking at bureaucracy being replaced by another form of organizing, which would be more, I'll call it more organic. And I think this could be facilitated by technology. So the idea of permissionless it's just a code word for basically saying I can make decisions without having to double check all the time whether it's correct or not.
Yes, fascinating. Thanks for sharing that. This notion of asking for permission really reminds me that most of the time when I look into organizations, and I've been able to work with the UN and like startups and really larger and smaller organizations around the world, and whenever I go into these organizations, what I observe is that first, most people start to complain, right? They say like, oh, we're so traditional, or we're so slow, or we don't know what's going to happen next, and so forth, right? So it's that notion of like you really see that people in that organization kind of like blame something else or someone else for the situation they find themselves in. The second thing that I find is that when you talk to individuals is that they're finding that excuse that, oh, I don't have permission to do that, right? When I ask them like, how do you innovate? What are some of the new ideas you're trying out, and so forth? And when you push on that, most people say like, I don't have permission, right? From my leader or from manager or the CEO or whatever it is.
Mm-hmm.
And so I find that fascinating because you should not wait for permission, right? You should really try something as an experiment, right? It could be a micro experiment, and try to really learn as fast as possible. Mm-hmm. And that is something where you don't need to ask someone to give you a permission slip and say like, now you can do that idea, because an idea is always a bet on the future, right? It's something where nobody knows if it's going to turn out to be working or not working. It's going to be great or not great. You can only find out by experimenting. And I think even individuals should stop asking for permission and start asking for forgiveness, right? When, things, probably don't turn out to work. But even that forgiveness is something that you should probably not ask for, because what you've done is you've learned something, right? You've tried something as an idea. You empowered yourself to move forward and make progress. And then now you share the learnings with everybody else. And that's something very, very, very helpful in every organization. So don't start looking around for someone who gives you permission to do something, right? To invent the future. Start doing it, right? And start just creating some value by learning what works and what doesn't work, and experiment your way forward. And so that for me has always been a great reminder that there is no one in your life that gives you permission, right? Give yourself permission to really be that explorer that we want to see.
Mm-hmm. And this seems like a really good time to bring up what you call the Dimension X that we all have. And I think people would find that really inspiring to talk about what is it that we uniquely bring to a situation.
Yes. So the Dimension X is really a unique superpower that you have, right? That really, for me, it comes to life in that notion that the future isn't about fitting in, right? It's about unlocking your superpower and using it to create what's next. So everybody has a unique superpower. For me, it's fascinating that most of the people don't know what their superpower is. So I help people to do a life mapping exercise where they really look at the highs and lows in their lives, at the milestones and so forth, to really reflect about what was the superpower that I used all the time to overcome challenges. And so that superpower is something that you can become aware of, that you can really then put to use moving forward. And that Dimension X is something that I think everybody should
So that's
discover and find out more about.
I don't know how well you can see this, but that's a picture of the map in the book that I really like. It's an exercise I can highly recommend. It's drawing a map of your life, right? The highs and the lows and what you learned from them. And then what I like to add to it too is a values dimension, which is what are the things that experience caused you to take away.
Absolutely, yes. That's a great addition. Thank you.
Oh yeah, and
thanks for that, Anne.
yes, it's an and. Absolutely, it's an and. And the way that we use it, we often use it in our courses at Columbia. The life mapping, it shows people how those formative experiences really resulted in quite different sets of beliefs. Quite different sets of values that people can then learn to understand each other better. So it's drawing a map, figuring out what what are the highs and lows, and what are you really good at. And you're right, lots of people just don't seem to be aware of what it is that makes them unique.
Absolutely, yeah. And you can go beyond that by not just discovering your unique superpower, but also share that with others, right? And ask others, like, what do you see like is my superpower? Because if you get that feedback from others where they say like, Rita is great in like connecting, right, the dots, or like, superpower around empathy or curiosity or whatever it is, right? You can really put that to use and say like, okay, now I'm gonna let my team actually know that this is a unique superpower that I want to bring to that project or that work that you're gonna embark on. And just imagine if leaders have access to these unique superpowers of their teams, right, that are not visible right now, right? Because it's not a skill set in itself. It's something that is, again, like something that probably was hidden before and that people were not aware of. But now you can choose team members not based on their skill set, but based on their unique superpowers. And you put someone together who has a tremendous superpower in empathy with someone who is deeply curious, someone who can connect the dots, someone who is a great communicator, a storyteller, and so forth. And you now have a very diverse set of these Dimension X in your team. And I think that's going to be tremendously helpful if you then want to innovate and create something new.
Absolutely. I had not thought about it that way and I had not thought about using the exercise that way until reading that chapter. Well, I see time has just flown by. I often like to wrap these up with a question, which is, how do the people listening in learn more? How do they, beyond buying the book, of course, how can they find out more about your world and your perspectives?
Yes. So again, like if you're not curious about the future, like don't get the book, right? And I think it goes beyond knowing what the future will bring, right? It's about creating the future that you want to see happening. And I think that's what we all want to get better at, right? Just kind of like make that future happening that you want to see. And there's other ways you can train yourself in being future ready. I have a next letter that drops every second Friday. One is actually out right now, today. So feel free to sign up. It's called Next Letter with my name, Frederik Pferdt. And there's a podcast that will be released in 2 weeks. It's called The Future is How. It really helps you to understand how you can shape a better future moving forward. So check that out.
Great resources, great conversation. It's been such a pleasure getting to know you a bit. And thank you very, very much. Thanks, everyone. Have happy Friday and have a lovely weekend.
Thank you so much for having me.